If the Qur'an confirms the gospel, why don't Muslims believe it? Imagine this situation. A holy book tells people, follow the gospel. But the followers of that religion say, the gospel cannot be trusted. That raises a serious question. Why would God command people to follow a book that is corrupted? This is one of the most interesting questions when comparing Islam and Christianity. And surprisingly, the question actually comes from the Qur'an itself. Let's examine what the Qur'an says. What the Qur'an says about the gospel. In Qur'an 5:46, we read this statement. We sent Jesus, the son of Mary, confirming the Torah that came before him, and we gave him the gospel, in which was guidance and light. Think carefully about those words. The gospel was given by God, and it contains guidance. But the verse says something else. It says the gospel contains light. Now listen to the next verse. Qur'an 5:47 says, let the people of the gospel judge by what Allah has revealed in it. This is very important. The Qur'an is not telling Christians to abandon the gospel. It is telling them to judge by it. In other words, follow what it says. The light in the gospel. But this raises another question. If the gospel contains light, what exactly is that light? To answer that, we need to read the gospel itself. In the Gospel of John 8:12, Jesus says something extraordinary. He says, I am the light of the world. Whoever follows me will not walk in darkness, but will have the light of life. Notice something powerful here. The gospel doesn't just talk about light as an idea. Jesus himself says, he is the light. The light mentioned in the gospel is the person Jesus Christ. So when the Qur'an says the gospel contains guidance and light, the gospel explains that the true light is Jesus himself. Now here is where the real problem appears. Many Muslims today claim something different. They say, the gospel has been corrupted. But if the gospel was already corrupted, why would the Qur'an tell Christians to judge by it? Why would God command people to follow something that had already been changed? That would mean God is directing people to a false message. And that raises a serious logical difficulty. The Qur'an says God's words cannot be changed. In fact, the Qur'an itself says something very clear about God's words. In Qur'an 6:1-15 it says, no one can change the words of Allah. And in Qur'an 18:27 it says, no one can alter his words. Think about that carefully. If the gospel was truly given by God, and if no one can change God's words, then how could the gospel become corrupted? Either God's words cannot be changed, or the gospel is corrupted. Both claims cannot be true at the same time. So what happens when we read the gospel? We discover something very different from what many people expect. Jesus didn't teach that salvation comes from passing a religious test. He taught something much deeper. In Gospel of John 14:6, Jesus said, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. That means salvation is not about perfect performance, it is about coming to Jesus. The Bible explains this clearly. In Epistle to the Ephesians 2:8-9 it says, for by grace you have been saved through faith, not by works, so that no one can boast. Christianity teaches that salvation is a gift of God's grace, not something we earn. So let's bring everything together. The Qur'an says, the gospel was given by God. Christians should judge by it. But many Muslims today say, the gospel is corrupted, so the question is unavoidable. If the Qur'an is correct, then the gospel must still contain the guidance and light of God. And if the gospel still contains that light, then we must seriously consider what Jesus said. Because Jesus didn't just claim to teach the truth. He said something even greater. He said, I am the light of the world. So here is the question for every honest seeker of truth. If the Qur'an confirms the gospel, and if the gospel says Jesus is the light of the world, then the real question becomes, are we willing to follow the light wherever it leads?
Standing for truth and exposing false teachings. Subscribe, like, and share for more wisdom from God's Word.